If you enjoy strange stories from the unknown, stick around. You have found your people. Welcome to the Dixiecryptid podcast. All right, here we go.
I do a lot of fishing, and occasionally I get out there overnight for some full moon action. One night, I was the only boat on the lake when at 4 a.m., a long and loud Bigfoot call came from the woods quite a distance away. What idiot would be out here at 4 a.m. making Bigfoot calls, I thought. And then I smiled. What idiot would be here fishing at 4 a.m. to hear it, I thought, chuckling at myself. Another afternoon on the same lake, I heard a scream from the woods coming from a young deer in pain. And not long after, I heard the deer running full blast toward me, and I watched it launch itself off the bluff at full speed from 8 feet above the water level and hit the water with a big splash. It swam to a thick growth of reeds along the bank, squeezed into them, and it laid down to hide. I never did see what was after the deer, but it spooked me just the same. My son loves archery deer hunting. He got his stand set up in a brand new area and arrived pre-dawn for his very first hunt a few mornings later. He was there all alone and excited to hopefully get close to one of the monster bucks that had been gracing his trail cams. After a good trek from his pickup, he reached the stand. The forest was totally silent, but when he raised his foot to take the first step up, that silence was broken by a sudden, shocking scream from something close by. It caught him so off guard that he nearly wet himself and briefly considered running back to his truck. But he realized it was too far, and he quickly climbed the 15 feet up to the seat of his stand instead. He sat there with his heart pounding so hard that he thought it would rip out of his chest, all the while worried about the next 90 minutes, where he would have to sit in complete darkness until the sun came up, in the mercy of whatever beast was lurking nearby. He described the scream as that of a desperate woman being murdered. It only lasted a few seconds, but it was so intense that the sound of it reverberated through his whole body and shook him to his core. Well, nothing happened after that, but that sort of experience makes a guy think twice about wanting to go hunting out there again. One evening, I was with a group of bass fishermen sitting around the fire pit at a fishing lodge. At gatherings like that, the topics of conversation could range from UFOs to sports to solving the world's problems. But that evening, the topic was Bigfoot. About a dozen guys were there, and each of them was open-minded enough that, even though none of them had encountered one, they each believed in the possibility of these creatures existing. After a while of listening but not saying a word on the subject, I finally decided to tell my story. So I cleared my throat and I leaned forward. In response, the group of men went quiet, the way you do when the silent reserve types speak up, knowing that if they're going to open their mouths, it's for a good reason. I should have taken that as a compliment by their demeanor, but I didn't. I felt sick remembering what happened, but I wanted these men to know what I saw. I wanted them to be prepared. I have been a lifelong outdoorsman, hunting and fishing all over the country. I had never seen or heard anything remotely like a Bigfoot, and I was 100% sure there was no such thing. One morning, I arrived at my stand in the Midwest for an archery deer hunt. My stand was set up within range of a game trail that emptied out into the open meadow. I sat there in total silence, and as hunting sometimes goes, this morning had no activity at all. The sun rose on that crisp, clear fall day, and though it took all my patience, I stayed there till 9:30 a.m. I was 5 seconds from packing up and heading back to the truck when my ears picked up a twig snap from up the trail. Okay, I thought, maybe my patience is about to pay off. I settled back into my stand, ready to watch what must have been a monster buck coming my way, judging by the heavy thudding of its feet. And a few minutes later, my quarry finally came into view. What in the world? I thought. It wasn't a deer. It was the biggest, hairiest, muscle-bound son of a bitch I had ever seen, walking on two legs, and he was coming my way. The creature that I was 100% sure did not exist was coming right at me, and there was no denying its existence at that point. I imagined the thousands of painful things it was capable of doing to me, and I thought about what a blessing a quick, miserable death would be if this thing caught me. I sat as silent and as unmoving as I could, grasping my shaking hands together and praying it would not look my way. And when it turned away from me, I realized I had been holding my breath, and I gasped for air. Then I watched in horror as this thing stopped in its tracks and turned its head slightly in my direction. I put my hands over my mouth and I felt my stomach sink, and by an act of God it lost interest and it walked into the open meadow ahead of me. It sat down on the ground and began digging up roots and eating them. And it did that for about an hour, with me helplessly watching on, afraid to move, afraid to breathe, and afraid to make the slightest sound. Finally, it got up and continued walking away from me, never giving any indication that it knew I was there. And when it finally disappeared from sight, I climbed out of that stand and set an Olympic record in the quarter-mile back to my truck. I never went back, not even to get my deer stand. When I finished my story, the men around the campfire stared at me in silence for a long minute, trying to process what I had told them. It must have been the look of fear on my face as I told the story, because the demeanor of the group had changed, and I could tell they believed me. It took a few more minutes before someone was brave enough to break that silence and carry on with a lighter topic, but their light banter turned to white noise. I knew they were talking, but I couldn't hear the words. The sounds of twigs snapping in the heat of the flames took me back to my deer stand, and there I was again, looking at that impossible creature with my own two eyes, knowing the experience had changed me for the worse, knowing that my life of hunting would never be the same. I live up in British Columbia, Canada. When my youngest granddaughter was 7, she wanted a pet. Of all things, her parents let her get a pot-bellied pig. But the pig became quickly a handful for my daughter, and when she and her husband started talking about surrendering the pig to a petting farm, I decided it was time for little piggy to move in with me. On a clear and cold Canadian night, when the temperature outside was a blistering minus 35 degrees Celsius, which means minus 31 degrees Fahrenheit, Piggy and I were inside enjoying the warmth of the house when a terrible racket sounded in my backyard. The pig was so startled that he started screaming and grunting like he was afraid for his life. Nothing I did could calm him down, and the thought of something being in the woods in the deadly cold temperatures was unsettling. My backyard backs up to a thick stand of trees, mostly pines and cottonwood, but also birch, which has a very hard trunk. And in the middle of that pig's commotion came a loud slap, like a giant hit his hand against the birch trunk. It was far too loud to be a human, and because of the pig's reaction, I was certain it was something I wanted nothing to do with. When I told my daughter about it, she laughed it off and said it was a Bigfoot coming to get the pig for dinner. Based on that pig's reaction that night, she may have been right. Years before, I had a sighting. People tried to convince me that it was a bear crossing the road, but I know what I saw, and it was no bear. Now, after listening to your podcast and hearing about others' experiences, I am sure that is what I saw. Thank you for the stories. I love listening to your channel. Cheers, Granny Linda. I grew up in the suburbs of Columbia, South Carolina. Since both my parents worked full-time, my days were spent with my grandparents, mainly my grandfather. He was not a blood relative, but a stepfather to my dad, and he was the only grandfather I ever knew, and he was my world. He was a World War II Korean War, Vietnam War veteran, and a full-blooded native Kiowan. He grew up in the Caddo Indian Reservation in Oklahoma and passed along many of his stories to me. Now, I'm not sure if my connection with him brought this on, but I have been sensitive to spirits and beings since my first encounter at 5 years old. When I was 5, my granddad got ill and was bedridden for a month. I was walking through the house and headed into his room when I almost ran into someone. I looked up and there stood a being taller than anyone I had ever seen before. He had the body of a man but the head of a wolf. He was covered in fur from the waist down and had a broad chest with dark copper-colored skin. He was a wolf man. He wasn't trying to hurt me, but as a small child I instantly panicked. And when I started backing up, he stepped toward me and ducked to pass through the doorway into the next room. I returned and ran crying to my grandmother. I don't think I ever explained to her what I saw. It's not that I could have at 5 years old anyway. My grandfather recovered but fell ill again 2 years later. His health was up and down for a few years, and he was ultimately moved to assisted living about a year before his death. While at the assisted living facility, I would sometimes be dropped off for a few hours to visit with him. I was an exceptionally well-behaved kid, and the management allowed me to be there unsupervised. One time, days before my 11th birthday, I was dropped off to visit my grandfather, and I stepped off the elevator onto his floor, and I made my way down the hall to his room, and at the end of the hallway, I saw that wolf man again. He was peering around the corner watching me, and the nurses and staff were passing right by him. That's when I realized that I was the only one who could see him. I tried to stay calm, ignored his presence, and went on to see my grandfather. When it was time for me to go home, I looked out for the wolf man at the end of the hall where I had seen him before, but he wasn't there. But as the elevator doors opened up, there he stood so tall that his head was touching the ceiling. I gathered up all the courage I had, and I walked into the elevator. And I swear to you, time slowed down when the doors closed. He knelt down and placed a scary-looking clawed hand on my shoulder, and he began to speak to me in a native tongue that I didn't understand. I'm not sure what he said or how long I was there with him, but the next thing I knew, the doors opened on the ground floor, and he was gone. The encounter gave me a safe and peaceful feeling, but sadly, my grandfather passed the following week. 12 years later, I was 22 and married, and I had one child, still a toddler. I was out one night on my back porch when I saw the wolf man at the back fence line standing in the woods, and when I got up to greet him, he was gone. Within a week, my son became ill and was hospitalized. The doctors couldn't explain his condition, and they were preparing us for the worst. I did a lot of praying and begging to God, and my son made a recovery overnight. His condition was never explained medically. 3 years passed, and I worked as a mechanic on the second shift. 4 p.m. to 1 a.m. were crappy hours for a family man with 2 kids. But it was a government job with good benefits and a guaranteed paycheck. I was on my motorcycle going home from work to see my wife and kids for supper, and as I rode the 2 miles of rural road that led to my neighborhood, I saw the wolf man again. The wolf man was just off the road into the wood line, and he was pacing me at 50 miles per hour. He was running upright like a man, but with a stride that I couldn't explain. I paid him no attention, though, and I continued home. The next evening, I was on my way home again to eat with my family when I was hit by a truck that ran a red light. I was in bad shape, and I came close to dying with blood loss from the lacerations. I had 2 surgeries for all the broken bones, and I spent nearly 2 weeks in the hospital and had a 6-month recovery. I finally realized what this wolf man was there for, or what I think he was there for. I think this being is somehow connected to me and there to warn me of death or danger or illness. 12 years passed before I saw him again. My grandmother was turning 97, but had recently endured some major medical setbacks. The weekend before her 97th birthday, I was at the local lake out on a pontoon boat with the family. Late at night, I saw the wolfman standing at the water's edge across the cove where we were camping. I knew what that meant and who he was there for. While I tried to shrug it off, I knew what was coming. My grandmother passed the next week, only a day after her 97th birthday. And while the wolfman isn't the only supernatural encounter that I've had, it's the most prominent and most reoccurring one in my life. Feel free to use my story if you like, just not my name. Even in a world where the supernatural and aliens are now accepted, the people who speak up about them are not accepted. Many years ago, my friend Jim was a flight engineer for Pacific Southwest Airlines. This was way back when a flight engineer was required on the earlier passenger jets. Jim flew on a regular scheduled flight from San Diego to San Francisco, California, and back again each day. He'd been flying this schedule for many years with no difficulties. They always flew over land, although the safety advisor always included the statement that your seat cushion is a flotation device. Once during one of his daytime flights north to San Francisco, he and the pilot had an interesting experience. Halfway through the northbound flight, the co-pilot noticed a plane on the same course as them to the east. The problem was that it was much closer than the allowed 5 miles, which was dangerous and against regulations. The co-pilot informed the pilot and contacted air traffic control. Air traffic control acknowledged the other plane's unsafe distance and tried to contact them. They received no response, which was unusual. After several unsuccessful attempts to contact the other aircraft, Jim's plane was directed to turn slightly to the west, moving to a safer distance. But once his plane did this, the other aircraft moved toward them, again flying much too close. There were more attempts to contact the other aircraft, but they got no response. Air traffic control told Jim's plane that it was most likely a private plane with radio trouble, and then instructed them to move west again to gain that safe distance. They did this, but once again the other aircraft moved with them, only this time it came even closer than before. This continued until Jim's plane was forced to fly over the ocean. And in the meantime, the other aircraft had gotten close enough to Jim's plane that they had a clear visual of it. That's when they saw that it was not an airplane at all. It was a cigar-shaped object that slowly but surely was getting closer to them. Jim's plane received instructions to move 10 miles out over the ocean, way off course. It was finally able to continue on its way, arriving just a few minutes later than scheduled and without further incident. Simultaneously, the U.S. Navy scrambled fighter jets to try to identify and move the UFO out of the way and hopefully force it to land. The 3 Navy fighters surrounded the UFO, one on either side and one behind it. And as they attempted to move it in the direction they wanted it to go, the UFO instantly sped up, reaching speeds unachievable by the fighters. And then, just as quickly, it flew vertically into the air and was out of sight and radar detection in seconds. That story never made the news. There's no surprise there, and Jim never mentioned if they spoke about it again after that. What's interesting to me is the way Jim relayed the tone of the air traffic control. It was all very standard, as if they had dealt with this situation countless times before. It's a good story to remember the next time you fly. Keep your eyes open. You may have company. My name is Rick, and I was born and raised in Virginia Beach. Growing up, I remember listening to the Little Caesars commercial advertising the Bigfoot-sized pizza with a Bigfoot puppet. The reason I bring that up, I will get to. In 1997, I was 13 years old, and I was visiting my cousins at my uncle's place in Pungo, Virginia Beach. His trailer was adjacent to some cornfields where they frequently saw deer. Directly east of his trailer was a North Landing River Natural Area Preserve, which connects to the Great Dismal Swamp. My uncle was a Marine, and being in the country, he taught us about muzzle awareness, firearm safety, and, of course, how to shoot at a young age. One day, my cousins and I wanted to explore the woods and swamp around his trailer and try to make it to the river. That's all us kids ever wanted to do back then, explore the swamp and woods. We carried on through about halfway to the river and then stopped to look at some snakes and a couple of turkeys. And out of nowhere, I smelled something rotten. "It's just fart rocks," my cousin Charles said. Well, I shook my head. "No, man, that's coming from downwind. It's way worse than a fart rock," I said, almost dizzy from the sharp, stinging smell. The next thing I knew, my other cousin Marshall and our friend Mark started yelling. "A bear crouched down, look," they shouted. We followed them closer to the bear to see for ourselves, and sure enough, there it was, just sitting there, hunched over behind a rock. We fell back about 30 yards to give it some space, all the while keeping our eyes on it. My cousin decided it would be a good idea to shoot at it, so he aimed his pellet rifle and he tried to take a shot. The rest of us told him there was no way he was going to take down that big old bear with that little rifle. The worst thing he'd do is provoke it, and then the rest of us would be in a world of trouble. So we talked him out of it and decided to go and get some real guns instead. Nothing was stopping us from getting to that river. We jogged back to my uncle's trailer and got a .22 handgun and a .410 shotgun. We never mentioned why we wanted them, probably because we knew he'd rail into us for going after a bear, and our 13-year-old selves weren't exactly eager to piss off an old salty Marine. A while later, we made it back to the spot where we saw the bear, but when we didn't see anything, we decided to trek onward to the river. We made it there without any excitement, which was disappointing. We had been looking around the whole time for that bear or any kind of a critter, determined to shoot something, but the opportunity never came. After wandering around and playing with sticks, we headed home, and halfway back that rancid smell hit us again. It was terrible. We started looking for a skunk because, at the time, that's as wild as our imaginations went as far as horrible stenches, though the smell of a skunk or even a dead rotting animal would have been a sweet relief compared to this. We kept looking and bam, there was the bear again. Immediately, we pointed our guns at it, ready to take it down, but we never stood a chance. It stood upright, over 6 feet tall, and it started charging at us on 2 legs, its 2 long arms swinging at its side. That thing was not a bear. It had no ears like a bear, and its eyes were in front of its face. Its face was beige, and its hair was shaggy and black. Basically, a big black furry swamp thing was coming right at us. When we realized how big it was, we ran for our lives and hightailed it out of there. The only other time in my whole life that I ran that fast was when I ran from the police once in my later years. When we got back to the trailer, we found my dad and uncle out front drinking. And when I started yelling, they came off the porch to see what was going on and what we were running from. "It's a Bigfoot," I shouted. "Well, how do you know that?" one of them asked. "'Cause it looked like a Bigfoot from the pizza commercial, that's how," I yelled. They started to brush our story off and told us it was just a bear. But right then, in the distance behind us, we heard a loud, deep growl. "You see? You ever hear a bear sound like that?" I asked them, knowing they sure as hell hadn't, but would call us crazy anyway. Which is just what they did. They called us crazy, and they asked if we had smoked a joint. And they told us to stay around the house and that they would go looking for it later. I'm not sure if they ever did that, though. 15 years later, my cousins and I were out drinking when this story came up. Still today, we were all certain that it was a Bigfoot or a swamp ape. I was researching Bigfoot sightings the other night, and sure enough, there was a sighting reported just north of us at this location some years later, right by my uncle's trailer. I sure hope my uncle hears the story. Not too crazy after all, is it, Uncle? That's going to wind it up for this podcast. Thanks for listening all the way to this end. I'm sorry I didn't put any commentary with these stories. They were all so good. But again, I am busy at work and I'm in here early in the morning trying to crank these out because these stories are just too good not to put out there for you to hear. I hope you enjoyed it, and we'll see you guys on the next one. Thank you.